Hi, everyone, and welcome to Preservation in Action, Saving the Wilbur J. Cohen Federal Building. I'm Mary Oken, Assistant Director of Living New Deal. Very briefly, Living New Deal is a small donor-supported nonprofit and the main online hub for New Deal history. We map sites across the country, share educational resources, and host programs like tonight's webinar, which we'll post to our website for those unable to attend. As part of our Advocating for New Deal Art initiative, we recently launched in the last year a national campaign to save the Cohen Building in Washington, D.C. To set the tone for discussing our campaign, I want to start with a quote from Frances Perkins, one of the architects and champions of Social Security, our nation's most important social safety net. Of the New Deal and what it accomplished, she said, quote, "It was an attitude that found voice in expressions like, the people are what matter to government, and a government should aim to give all of the people under its jurisdiction the best possible life." That idea is literally built into the Cohen Building, and it is what motivates our campaign to save what the founder of the Living New Deal, Gray Brecken, has coined the Sistine Chapel of New Deal art. We launched the Save the Cohen Building campaign last fall because the Cohen Building is a nationally significant historic site. In 2007, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places and the DC Inventory of Historic Sites. These designations afford protections under the National Historic Preservation Act, specifically Section 106, and municipal historic preservation laws. Plans affecting the building and its art must undergo public review to minimize harm, particularly to the art which is permanently affixed to the building's walls. The actions of the administration this fall made clear that we cannot assume that those in power will protect and save such historic places. The launch of our campaign followed national news coverage by Timothy Noah of the New Republic, a leading champion for the Cohen Building and its art. I'm happy to share that Tim and other journalists who have covered the Cohen Building story will be featured on another webinar next month. A link to register will be published soon on Living New Deal's website, our Eventbrite, and our social media, so please look out for that. Tonight, we're joined by 5 leading experts on the Cohen Building, historic preservation law, and federal real estate disposal. Daniel Leckie and Michelle Arcari-Rose are both advisors to L&D's Save the Cohen Building campaign. Daniel is an architectural historian and preservationist who has worked in local, state, and federal agencies, including working at the GSA on plans to modernize and preserve the Cohen Building's architecture and art. Michelle is the former Associate General Counsel and Director of Contracts at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. She is also a professor of law and the Executive Director of a historic site in Virginia. Our other panelists are Priya Jan, AIA, Associate Professor of Architecture at Texas A&M University and Chair of the Society of Architectural Historians Heritage Conservation Committee. Betsy Merritt, Deputy General Counsel of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and Marian Werkheiser, Managing Member of Cultural Heritage Partners and co-founder of Art Glass USA. Please note that each of our panelists tonight join us and speak as individuals. Any statements they make as part of this webinar do not represent one another or the current or former institutions with which they are affiliated. This is a quick look at the Living New Deal's website and specifically our visualization of New Deal sites. This is a national map that documents over 19,000 New Deal projects across all 50 states and Puerto Rico. Just before and during the pandemic, we mapped New Deal sites in Washington, D.C., revealing an extraordinary concentration, including the Cohen Building. Here is a close-up of the National Mall area on our map. The Wilbur J. Cohen Federal Building stands out for its exceptional number of artworks marked in red, and you can see an arrow pointed towards them. Now my colleague Dan will tell you a little bit more about the Cohen Building's architecture.
Thanks, Mary. I want to take a moment to walk everybody a few steps into the Cohen building from a historian's perspective. And please consider this a teaser trailer for a future webinar that Mary and I are developing, going deeper into the Cohen's art and architecture. So one of my favorite aspects of this building is its conceptual balance. American architects have long wrestled with this fundamental tension. Should the things we build symbolize America's place among great civilizations of the past, or honestly express and celebrate the modern world, as embodied in Louis Sullivan's oft-paraphrased 1896 treatise, Form Follows Function? In the 1930s, that balance was askew in Washington as the government grew and new monumental office buildings were built in a classical language that was outwardly impressive but sometimes poorly functioning. Confusing circulation, grand staircases to nowhere, small windows set behind false columns that obscured natural light. And while they were meant to support a modern, efficient government, sometimes the buildings clung to incompatible forms. It was within this tension that architect Charles Clowder found a niche. Known for the architecture he designed on many college campuses, Clowder was deeply fluent in many historic languages, but he often applied these forms in new and unique ways, including his towering Cathedral of Learning seen on the right. In the Cohen building, he didn't abandon symbolism. In this case, he looked to ancient Egypt, but he restrained that excess decoration. And the result is a building that is monumental but uncluttered, an efficient compromise intended to serve the people, much like Social Security itself. You feel this immediately as you approach from Independence Avenue, with its slanted pilasters and convetto cornices echoing the temples of Luxor or Giza. But as you get a bit closer, bas-relief panels of working people above the entrance signal that this is a different kind of temple. It's a temple for the people. Taking a step inside the vestibule at Independence Avenue, you're instantly awed by Seymour Fogle's frescoes depicting a nation dawning on the age of progress. As you slowly stroll down the corridor, Ben Shaw's On Social Security presents a question, a fork in the road, two possible futures, inviting us to contemplate how we'll move forward into this coming golden age. At the building's core, symbolism slowly gives way to clarity. Humble yet dignified Art Deco ornament, polished Vermont Verde marble, and very importantly, clear vertical circulation with modern elevators and escalators that move people upward toward the work of governance, an altar truly befitting the People's Temple. In that balance between legacy and modernity, the Cohen building becomes something rare, a place where symbolism and greater purpose reinforce each other. For that reason, I believe it holds a profoundly relevant place in our national identity and is worth our best efforts at historic preservation. Thank you.
The building's art responds directly to the ideas and promises of Social Security, which passed into law in 1935. Wilbur J. Cohen, for whom the building was renamed in the 1980s, was the first employee of the Social Security Board. Through the New Deal section of Fine Arts, artists were selected by blind review to decorate this building with Social Security themed art. They created over 2,500 square feet of in situ artwork, much of it fragile and difficult, if not impossible, to relocate. On the exterior are sculptures carved in carnelian granite by Henry Kreis and Emmylou Davis, which were completed and installed above what were the building's main doors in 1941. As visible in their figures' dress, the sculptures show ordinary people, working families, and the promise and limits of Social Security. One of Davis's sculptures, Family Group, subtly critiques how the initial years of Social Security deliberately excluded domestic workers, many of whom were women and people of color. Inside the Independence Avenue vestibule, which would have been a main entrance to the building, we have Seymour Fogle's fresco murals painted directly onto the walls. On the left-hand side, you see Wealth of the Nation, which shows how Social Security strengthens industry, science, and innovation. On the right, Security of the Family depicts leisure and stability made possible by New Deal era legal protections, Social Security, as well as the abolition of child labor. Notice also the original bronze doors and ventilation grates. Moving through the building, Vermont Verde marble paneled halls We reach Voice of America, the primary tenant of the building today, which before January of last year broadcasts news and diplomacy to over 159 countries. VOA is another federal agency that has suffered extreme staff and funding cuts in the last year. Reflected in the marble is Ben Shah's monumental mural series that lines this hallway, The Meaning of Social Security, which is the largest and most fragile artwork in the building. One side shows insecurity before the Social Security Act was passed, unemployment, homelessness, illness. Among the most haunting images is a boy on crutches for whom injury once meant ruin. Across the hall, Sean depicts workers supported by Social Security, holding good jobs, aging with dignity, and building savings protected after 1933 by the New Deal's FDIC, created to prevent ordinary Americans from ever losing their savings again due to bank failures. Passing through the Sean murals, we reach the auditorium where a movable screen is painted by Philip Guston, with frescoes reflecting themes of Reconstruction and family well-being. Again, fairness, represented by leisure time and childhood play, demonstrate the fruits of good government. Finally, in a fifth-floor boardroom, the Magafan sisters' Mountains in Snow by Ethel and Jenna Magafan quietly reminds civil servants of the labor required to deliver for the American people. Notably, it is here that GSA staff and leading architecture and engineering firms met in 2024 to work on a feasibility study completed early in 2025 that made recommendations for the Cohen Building's future, which have yet to be released to the public that paid for them. This room looks out onto the National Museum of the American Indian. Imagine if the Cohen Building became a museum dedicated to the New Deal, public art, and working class history. Until December of 2024, no one planned to sell or demolish this building. However, that month, Joni Ernst, a retiring Iowa representative, surreptitiously added a provision into an unrelated water bill directing GSA to sell the Cohen Building, which was signed into law in January of 2025. The provision states a deadline: sale not later than 2 years after vacancy of existing federal agencies. The Administrator of General Services shall sell for fair market value at highest and best use the Wilbur J. Cohen Federal Building. Next, in February, shortly after the current administration took office, the Cohen Building appeared for the first time on a list of properties slated for accelerated disposal, a process that Priya Jan will explain falls outside standard protocol for a site of this significance.
Thank you, Mary. So when we started looking at the Cohen Building, I wanted to cast a slightly look in the past to see how other buildings that the GSA had identified for disposal had been treated. And what we found was in 2023, they had issued another list of 23 properties. And again, not all were sold at that time. Therefore, 13 of those still appear in last year's list. In 2025, this most recent list was released. And if folks remember from the news stories at that time, initially a very large list of 440 federal properties was issued, which was removed after a day, according to the administration, due to overwhelming interest. Thankfully, they reissued a much shorter list of 45 properties. And this is the list that the Cohen Building appeared on. And going back to, I think, what Mary said, January of that year, this appeared surreptitiously in that bill. And then in March, it appeared in the GSA list. Again, just reminding people that this building is on the National Register of Historic Places, identified as a significant historic building. So I was curious to see how other such buildings that the GSA has disposed of or have been on this list, have been talked about or treated. So some properties with the NRHP designation have been sold out of these lists by the GSA, and they have been sold with preservation covenants, which we will talk about a little bit later as well in this webinar, but which just means is that they have some protections associated with them so that even if they're sold, the historically significant features of the building are protected. And this kind of goes beyond the Cohen, but there are many mid-20th century buildings on this list, both the 2023 and the 25 list. Many of these are on the National Register, but many others are eligible. And the government, in my opinion, really needs to kind of look at them for eligibility, because many of them are quite significant, and only because they're kind of from the recent past, they have not yet been judged for their historic significance. And yet others have tried to get on the National Register but have failed. And I have two of the pictures here: the federal building in Washington, D.C., which had a failed bid in 2014 to get on the National Register. It was deemed ineligible due to loss of integrity. And another building, which is on this year's list, it's not on the National Register. There has been a call, which is the Liberty Loan Building. It's from the temporary war buildings era in Washington, D.C. But the GSA recently put out the press release when they announced the potential sale of this building, saying that it does not amount to much and it was poorly built. So that just kind of goes to some of the concerns around these. Let's go to the next page. This is just to say, because this is confusing for some folks, the GSA is a government agency that has been issuing, they're the steward, the landlord of all the government buildings. So they put out these lists for disposal. However, there is another parallel effort that started in 2016, which came out of this act, the Federal Assets Sale and Transfer Act, that created something called the Public Buildings Reform Board. It was supposed to be a 6-year program, but now they've extended it to December of this year. They set out 2 rounds in 2020 and then 2021 rounds of recommendations. Notable is that in 2021, they identified buildings. 10 of these are again on the GSA list. However, and there was a significant amount of Section 106 stakeholder consultation that was done. These buildings were not approved for sale due to some concerns over how all of that consultation happened. However, in 2025, another round of recommendations was released with 11 buildings identified, and the Cohen building is one of the buildings on this list. Curiously, in this report, there's very limited historical information on these 11 buildings, and almost no mitigation advice on any of the buildings. Next. These are just, I know they're hard to read, but these are the 4 pages from this report on the Cohen building. And what is interesting is that there is no mention of the building's National Register status in these 4 pages, which is very curious, because some other buildings that are on the National Register and included in this report do have that status mentioned when they list the building. Let's go to the next page. And finally, this is not new, because the government has gotten in trouble in the past for not disposing their historic buildings in the correct manner. An audit done by the US Postal Service identified lapses in when they sold 10 historic post offices and how they had failed to protect New Deal art and follow the Section 106 process back in 2014. And the ACHP has also, on their website, a lot of guidance about how to dispose of buildings that are on the National Register. That's it.
Thank you, Priya. The shocking demolition of the White House East Wing in October changed how we think about our campaign. Existential threats to historically designated sites are no longer theoretical. The message of bulldozers destroying the White House was unmistakable. No historic site in the United States is safe from harm. To demand transparency in October, we filed a Freedom of Information Act request seeking, among other things, the 2025 Cohen Building Modernization Feasibility Study, which was completed with taxpayer dollars last year, but is yet to be released to taxpayers for public consideration and review. We also requested consulting party status under Section 106, which the GSA granted to us in November, with assurances that no immediate action affecting the Cohen Building was planned. Simultaneously, Living New Deal was advised that while our historic preservation laws mandate the Section 106 review process, that process is not a guarantee of preservation. Preservation requires those in power to act honorably, and given what has happened in the past year, raising public awareness and concern becomes essential. It is why we launched and continue to promote a public petition through change.org that now has nearly 8,000 signatures. It's why we conduct press outreach. It's why we began publishing editorials to raise awareness about the threats to the Cohen Building and to historic preservation best practices more broadly. It's why we're here tonight with this webinar. A list of news coverage of our campaign is available on our website and the Save the Cohen Buildings campaign page, which we'll post in the chat. Just before the holidays, this past December, the threat of demolition for the Cohen building escalated. That shortly after the East Wing demolition, the administration announced a plan to paint the Eisenhower Executive Office building's marble exterior white, sparking litigation led by cultural heritage partners. While unrelated to the Cohen building, this case raised alarm bells when a retired senior GSA official declared under oath that the White House was circumventing historic preservation law and the GSA, not just by attempting to paint this historic structure, but also by simultaneously soliciting private bids for the demolition of 4 historic sites in Southwest DC, including the Cohen building. Rather than slowing down, in December, we intensified our efforts. Over the holidays, our grassroots monitoring, advocacy, and outreach continued, and support grew. Last month, which you see on the left, New York-based artists Judy Kozlov, Elise Engler, and Martha Rossler organized an open letter signed by hundreds of cultural workers urging museums to defend the Cohen Building's art, which led the director of the Jewish Museum to make a public statement and the international media to pay more attention. We very much hope other cultural institutions will step forward as well. Also in January, on the right, Social Security Works, a social welfare nonprofit organization that advocates for the expansion of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, also joined the effort, launching a website and petition which already has more than 80,000 signatures. At the same time, we are seeing coordinated efforts to weaken historic preservation protections through legislation, deregulation, and opaque federal property sales. Key review bodies, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the ACHP, the Commission on Fine Arts, the CFA, and the National Capital Planning Commission, the NCPC, have undergone unprecedented leadership changes in the last few months and are beginning to share plans that raise grave concerns. Just this past Friday, new directives at ACHP signaled potential revision to how Section 106 will be enforced, while revisions to GSA procedures quietly published on the Federal Register just before Christmas deregulate federal real estate disposals. These developments are deeply alarming for anyone committed to saving historic places so that future generations can enjoy them. The good news is that our coalition is growing. Journalists are reporting, advocates are mobilizing, institutions are beginning to speak out, and litigation defending historic sites and historic preservation law is underway. With that, I'm going to turn over discussion to our legal experts who will help us understand the laws protecting the Cohen Building, recent policy changes, and what's at stake for historic sites nationwide. Please note that panelists involved in active litigation will not be commenting on their cases tonight. Please welcome Michelle, Betsy, and Marion.
Did I not unmute? Hi, welcome. Thanks, Mary. It's really an honor to be here tonight with legal experts such as Betsy Merritt and Marion Werkheiser, who are certainly on the front lines trying to protect our buildings through our courts and other places. My first question I'll toss out to either of you. I think first, if you could help our audience and explain a little better where the Cohen Building falls in terms of review before it would be in any way remodeled or demolished or restored or sold. If you could give us maybe a brief explanation of what's the main federal law that would apply to this building and how things would proceed.
Erin, I'll give you first dibs.
Do you want me to give a quick overview of Section 106?
Yes. Well, and why this falls under that particular section of the National Historic Preservation Act.
Yeah, so you'll hear a lot of us nerdily talk about 106 all the time. That is the provision that requires the federal government to take into account the impact of its actions on historic properties. And when you have the federal government making the decision to sell a property, to issue a permit for a project, to spend money on some project, then Section 106 comes into play. And what happens is the government is required to identify any historic properties that would be impacted by its decision. Here you have a building that is already on the National Register of Historic Places, so we have a historic property. And then the government is supposed to consult with people who have an interest in the building, like the Living New Deal, who's now a consulting party. But certainly other community groups, community members can be consulting parties. The DC Historic Preservation Office would be a consulting party. And then the government is supposed to assess what the adverse effects would be to the building. So if they're going to demolish it, that's a pretty big adverse effect. If they're going to sell it, it depends on who they're selling it to, what the purpose will be as to whether the historic property will be impacted. So once there is an assessment of adverse effects, they will consult with the community, make sure they understand the full impact of those effects. And then there is a consultation that occurs where you're supposed to share ideas about how we would resolve those adverse effects. And what comes out of that is some sort of agreement document where the government is making certain commitments to avoid, minimize, or mitigate the adverse effects on the historic property. And that's why when Priya was talking before, she was talking about how some of these other buildings have had easements put on them or other mechanisms to protect various historic characteristics so that those are preserved even after the federal action takes place. Betsy, what did I miss?
Nothing. I was going to say the presumptive approach of GSA in a case like this, as they have been doing for other federal buildings that are going to be disposed of, is to propose to sell it subject to a preservation covenant. And then the consulting parties have the opportunity to weigh in on, is the proposed preservation covenant or easement strong enough? Are there enough safeguards to make sure that it would be protected in perpetuity? And the goal of the GSA staff and the goal of the consulting parties would be to reach agreement on a preservation covenant that would provide adequate long-term protection for the building. That's the win-win outcome that everybody wants going into this process. And GSA has a long history of success nationwide in these kinds of transactions. And so, although here the issues are more complicated because of all the interior artwork, and we would need to make sure that the artwork is adequately protected. But we would be optimistic that the consultation process could result in a consensus about an easement that would be a covenant that would adequately protect the building and the artwork. So that's the goal. Hopefully we could get there.
Well, now, so the GSA has a Historic Preservation Office. They have a federal preservation officer, and these dedicated professionals have been doing this for decades. So what changed? What makes this a little different? And for example, why are other historic buildings in the nation's capital treated differently? Like why is the White House being treated differently?
I guess one thing I'll just throw out one thing that's changed, and that is you have these congressional directives, like in the case of the Cohen building, as previously described, there is a congressional directive to dispose of the building and convey it out of federal ownership within 2 years after it's vacant. And it's not vacant yet, but that's a new thing, is the congressional pressure to dispose of all these buildings. So I would say that's one important change. GSA's got a much longer list of properties to deal with. Marion, other thoughts that you have about what's changed recently? Or
I think we're learning that there is a lot of political involvement in GSA and in other federal agencies, to the degree that we have not seen before, and a lot of efforts to circumvent typical process. So what we learned during our litigation over the Eisenhower Executive Office building was that GSA staff was learning after the fact that the White House was soliciting bids for demolition of these buildings. And so it seems as though the president and his office are taking a particular interest in DC's architecture in a way that we have not seen before.
Absolutely. So does a national historic, now just to clarify, does a national historic landmark get additional protections that just a building listed on the National Register of Historic Places would get?
Yes. So we have Section 106 will take into account effects on historic properties. And that means properties that are eligible for listing on the National Register or are already listed. So here the Cohen building is already listed. Then we have a separate category of historic properties that are National Historic Landmarks. And that's the highest level of significance that our nation recognizes. The Eisenhower Executive Office building is a National Historic Landmark. And when you have an NHL that's involved in a federal undertaking, there is a separate section of the National Historic Preservation Act that applies, Section 110 for all of us. And that requires that the federal government undertake all possible planning to minimize harm to that NHL. So it's a much stronger language than just taking into account the effects on a historic property. So we need to keep that in mind, as DC has a strong concentration of NHLs. It's where so many of our national monuments are.
Although I'll note, I don't believe the Kennedy Center is a National Historic Landmark designated.
No, in fact, I was looking at it today. It has been found eligible for listing. So Section 106 would apply, but it does not have that NHL designation yet.
Troubling. And again, I think it speaks to the rather organic nature of how buildings could be designated or have been designated as we've gone along throughout the history of our country, and certainly at the Capitol. So what happens? So we have an acknowledgement that it's an important historic building, that the government is going to undertake some kind of action that let's assume, impacts the building in a negative way. So what happens if the consulting parties are a group of experts who are brought in to advise an agency, in this case, the GSA, and the GSA disagree about what should happen to the Cohen building? What happens then?
well, you can have a disagreement at different levels. For example, you could have a disagreement about whether the property will be adversely affected, at the outcome of the consultation process. You could have the agency saying, no, we don't think this is what we're proposing to do to the building is going to adversely affect it. And the consulting parties and the State Historic Preservation Office might say, oh, we disagree. We think this will be an adverse effect. And there's a procedure for resolving those kinds of disagreements, usually by getting the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation involved and getting their view on whether there would be an adverse effect. Similarly, there could be disagreements on how best, if there is an adverse effect, how best to resolve it. What mitigation or minimization measures would be adequate. And again, often getting the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation involved in trying to resolve those disagreements is one thing. But ultimately, as Marion suggested, Section 106 doesn't mandate preservation. And so, although there are these really unique procedures, the consultation process, which is extremely effective, it doesn't ultimately mandate preservation. So we do our best as advocates to try to persuade the agency to, do something that's less harmful, to avoid and minimize harm and find ways of modifying what they're proposing to do. Mary, you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, I would just add, like, it's a really cool process because it requires the government to listen to us, like as regular people who
Literally
care
sit
about
around
these
a
places.
table.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
So it
unique
literally
in that
gets us,
respect.
like, that process gets us a seat at the table to share our concerns. It does not get us an outcome. And so the way that we end up, if those disputes cannot be resolved and the agency says, oh, Marion and Betsy, so sorry, so sad, we don't agree with you, we're going to still go ahead and we're going to demolish this building and we're not going to do anything to protect your historic place. We can take them to court, but what we're going to be arguing about is whether that process was sufficient. Like, were we given the opportunity to sit at that table? Did they respond to our concerns? Did the government make a decision that was informed, or was it an arbitrary decision? So we end up having a lot of fights about how that process was handled, as opposed to whether the outcome actually preserved the property or not.
So the president has this advisory council on historic preservation that is able to make regulations and advise him on what should happen with our most treasured historic buildings. That would they get involved at some point at this if the agency and consulting parties can't agree?
It's very rare for the members, the presidentially appointed members of the advisory council, to get involved in individual cases. Sometimes you would have an absolute termination of consultation that would be referred to the council, but that's extremely rare. Extremely rare. So that doesn't normally happen.
If they were to provide comments, are those historically, no pun intended, are those historically helpful in resolving controversial cases?
Helpful, but again, not binding, not mandatory. It's advisory council on historic preservation.
Now, we've seen some changes among other bodies in the city that govern historic preservation. We've seen significant changes in the Commission on Fine Arts. We've seen NCPC have a number of different changes, and we've also recently seen it with the Advisory Council. Now normally that is a body that is bipartisan and has members that come from, and we have expert members with special knowledge, and we have we have kind of a balance, and it's similar, I think, to the Fed and the Fed Reserve, that there's supposed to be some kind of independence or collaboration. It's not supposed to be a partisan office, but that has changed. How do you think that will impact, if anything, what happens to the Cohen?
I just think the most devastating impact on the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation has been this dramatic reduction in staff by more than 50%. And so that severely limits the capacity of the agency to get involved in resolving these these issues in a constructive way. So that's going, it's a brand new development. It's going to be a huge a huge loss as we go forward. That's the most concerning, because their staff, their professional staff was just excellent, and they've lost so many of them. Marion, other thoughts on your part or about the council going forward?
I think, in all the policy work that I've done on Section 106, advocating to Congress, advocating to the council, um, advocating to agencies, it always has enjoyed bipartisan support.
Yes,
We have had
absolutely.
champions on both sides of the aisle. Um, American heritage is a keystone value for almost all of us. And so we're not used to the advisory council being political. We, a few years ago, we got a presidentially appointed and Senate confirmed chair to the council, which makes it slightly more political just inherently. And we have some new appointees, but their first business meeting is coming up on the 12th. So we'll have to see if they have a political agenda or if they're coming to the table with these shared values.
Well, one of the things we just most recently heard from the vice chair, who's filling the roles of chair at the moment, Travis Voiles, who also wears a very pretty big hat at the Environmental Protection Agency, like many other officials in the administration at the moment, has said that he is looking to revise Section 106 regulations. Now these regulations have been in place for a long time, and again, it's a special, unique situation involving consultation, and they've worked with a pretty good success rate. What do you think that they might be looking to change, and how would that impact the Cohen building?
Marion, any thoughts on your part,
Yeah.
or?
I'm deeply concerned. I want everyone in our community to get over the first stage of grief, which is denial, and realize that this is happening. When the chair says they're going to revise the regs, they're going to revise the regs. Even if a lot of us in the preservation community think the regs are not the problem, if there are any inefficiencies in Section 106, they could be resolved through guidance documents or training or other things. But this is happening. I think a big impetus for it has been congressional concern about the speed of permitting more generally. And unfortunately, I think Section 106 is being scapegoated because we are not the thing that holds up projects. But some people are concerned about that. And most recently, the administration has rewritten the rules for NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act rules. Now, NEPA is a totally different statute from National Historic Preservation Act. They are independent obligations from federal agencies, but those reviews often happen simultaneously and in tandem. And so I think part of the reason why they want to revise the regulations is to reflect some of the changes that were made on the NEPA side. So I think we all have to be really vigilant and figure out ways to participate in this rulemaking and bring all of our expertise to the table to make sure that the changes actually solve the problems that the government is concerned about and don't muddy the waters.
Yeah, you mentioned some of the complaints are about permitting as well, and I would I think you both might agree with me that if you cut 75% of the staff at the General Services Administration that's doing the work, and then you cut 50% of the staff at the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation among permitting and then permitting office, people processing and the SHPOs processing permits, it's hard to argue that the necessarily the process is bad. It's just that you don't have enough people doing the process, and certainly we've seen empirical evidence and data that they process thousands of these and hundreds of these, depending on the body, each year, and there's just a handful that really get hampered and hunkered down in controversy.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess going forward with Cohen, what can folks out there who are conscientious and want to be supportive of making sure that the rules are followed, so to speak, before they change? What can people do? If they're not a consulting party, what can people do to help?
One step would be to request consulting party status for individuals and organizations that have a special interest. The Section 106 review has not been initiated yet by GSA, and we're not expecting it to happen next week or next month. So it'll be a while because there's this 2-year time period after the building is vacated, which we don't know how long that's going to take. So I think that the public outcry is being heard by GSA staff. I mean, they're well aware of these concerns, and that's useful. That's effective.
I'd also say if Congress directed the disposal, Congress can change their mind. So we should be directing some of that public outcry to members of Congress.
That's true.
I'll just jump in here for a second to say a kind of shout out to our recent ally, Social Security Works, who does, has been asking members of Congress to pay attention to this issue and, oppose demolition of the Cohen building. And I think, we're a small organization, but I have to say, in bringing on advisors, in, reaching out to people with concern, there's a general consensus and I think enthusiasm for saving this site and other sites as well. And so I think, I'm one person at our organization. There's a handful of us who've been really actively working to save the Cohen building. And I share that because if you want to do something, you can. And so you've got local members of Congress you can contact, you have national people you can contact, and you can certainly support organizations that are doing this work. Cultural Heritage Partners, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, DC Preservation League, Social Security Works, the Living New Deal, please. I think that part's important. I think also, in my experience, the press has been a core part of this, and I mentioned at the top of the hour that we'll have another webinar featuring journalists, and that's really key because the press plays a role as a core component of our democratic society to share with the public and to help people think critically about these decisions that are being made and how they impact all of us. It's worth saying that the Cohen building was paid for by tax dollars. We own it. It is ours. And so discussions about value should take into account the investments that we've made and, consider that in detail. It's part of the reason that we've been shouting from the rooftops about feasibility reports and so on. It's like wanting to know exactly how much is this precious real estate worth. Certainly the art, we can speak to how much that's worth for everyone and the experience of going into that space and thinking about Social Security as also an important and sadly embattled part of our national heritage. So I think talking to people, getting educated, pushing back, like those are all things you can do in small and bigger ways. So I'll just shout out for grassroots activism and making friends with like-minded people.
Hey, thanks for that, Mary. I just wanted to jump in and kind of expand a little bit on what was mentioned earlier about the kind of reductions in force and how that really impedes the ability to carry out the provisions of Section 106 from the agency standpoint and from the practitioners that are doing it. And just mention that in my experience and my unfortunately too short experience working at the GSA, that these are dedicated and incredible professionals that are doing their best in a really difficult situation. We had a lot of work even while I was there on a team of 6 that was reduced by probably 2/3, I believe. And so those people are really doing the people's work. They're dedicated civil servants, and I think they deserve a round of applause. And they don't get that enough from the media or from the politicals. So I'm going to do it here and just give a big thank you to all my friends and colleagues and sincerely mentors at the GSA. Thank you for what you do every day.
Yeah, and I think I meant to say that in my introduction as well. When we raise criticisms or concerns about GSA and the decisions that are being made, that is a direct concern and criticism put before the political appointees rather than the civil servant staff who've been dedicated and doing the hard work of ethical decision making, treatment of properties, treatment of our historic national heritage and so on. And so I think when people mention GSA, and when I talk to journalists, I make that distinction as clear as I can, make sure that you keep in mind that the agency as a whole, the different people within the agency do different things, and the people doing the hard work deserve a lot of credit and our consideration. And one more thing you can do, if you know a federal employee, give them a hug, send them take them out to dinner. I don't know. Say thank you on behalf of all of us.
Write your congressperson and let them know that you don't agree with the treatment and purging of our federal civil servants. They're just out there doing the people's work every single day.
I would just tack on to that, if I may. Also, historic preservationists, I think, get painted as obstructionists oftentimes because we want to pump the brakes and, really enforce consultation, which is, meaningful discussions about what could happen to a historic building that's important that or belongs to America. And I don't think that's the case. And so I hope that the Public Buildings Reform Board and other folks will hear that yes, while preservationists do want to save probably as much as we can in American history and the built environment, but that doesn't mean that reimagining the Southwest Quadrant or the buildings around and the spaces around these historic buildings can't be reimagined. It's really just about being inclusive so that that all voices are heard and that it's done in a thoughtful manner.
That might be a good point. I just wanted to jump in because I agree. When we look at historic buildings, in the larger scheme of things, these buildings that are on the National Register, they're still a very small percentage of our entire building stock. So preservationists are not saying, save every building, but yes, the ones that have already been determined to be significant by a group of experts, they definitely deserve, our highest care. There are some questions in the chat. I don't know, Mary, if you're that are related to this that I would love to kind of address in terms of, are there examples of kind of best case scenarios, other projects that have been disposed of that we think have been done in a good manner? So in terms of precedents, there are two buildings that I pointed out in my slides. That's the Huntsville Post Office and Courthouse in Alabama, and the Gus G. Solomon U.S. Courthouse in Portland, Oregon. These buildings had been kind of in the government work since 2021. They were identified by the Public Buildings Reform Board and the GSA list in the past. So they were recently sold, one to the city and the other one to a private developer, both with preservation covenants. And there is another building that the government has recently, in terms of, has the Trump administration since last year that the GSA kind of announced this, have they gone through any of these processes? So I know that a building has been sold, which appeared on the list in 2025 last year, which is the Des Moines Courthouse. It has been sold to a private developer who's converting it into, from the news reports, it seems like a luxury apartments. There is limited information if there is a covenant associated with it, but the building is on the National Register, and the news reports seem to indicate that the developer is planning to respect the historic significance of the building and is working with the state and the city historic board. So I'm not sure if there's an actual covenant, but from what I've read, it seems like there might be.
I just wanted to follow up on what Priya mentioned about that and how that playbook can kind of be instituted at Cohen by going back to my favorite project I worked on while I was at GSA, which was the feasibility modernization feasibility study that kind of worked to reimagine this building as sort of the pinnacle of energy efficiency and green technology called Passive House, and to just breathe new life into the building. Our intention at the time was to re-envision it as a new agency headquarters, but with a few tweaks, you could see it being an amazing adaptive reuse project for, the big thing we see all over the place is housing. Maybe the upper floors as housing and the lower floors as what Mary mentioned earlier, like gallery space, an expansion of the Smithsonian. There are so many things that could be done with this building to respect that history and kind of move forward. And the plan is in place. So, I just wanted to mention that and expanding on kind of what Priya had mentioned of those other examples.
It's also worth saying that the price tag for renovations, which I think, was like $1 billion, which sounds to an ordinary citizen like an extraordinary amount of money for a 1 million square foot structure. That's really not that extraordinary. And I've definitely come around to the private-public partnership. There's some really cool things that have been done with New Deal sites around the country, award-winning stuff, really exciting. And I talked with the project manager who worked on the feasibility study recently. He was telling me people in government and real estate developers were really excited by the cost savings that's possible with passive house design, that the rentable space per square foot in this 1 million square foot structure would be super efficient. And so part of the reason that we'd like for the government to give us access to that kind of study and give us the data so that we can come to the table and say, we don't think you should demolish this building. We think you should do something cool with it. We've already given money for you to come up with some good ideas about that. And we'd like to see some of those things realized, which would preserve the art within the building. I think that's reasonably, something we have the right and to request. And I think many other people are keen to see that happen. There's a lot of questions in the chat, one of which corrected something I said, so I want to make sure to say that. Philip Guston's work is painted on canvas, so the screen I showed you is not fresco, it's canvas attached to a screen. So as an expert pointed out, I wanted to make sure to say that and correct the record. One of the questions, and maybe Dan, if you want to take this on, reminding people about Social Security. You've spent the most time of all of us in the Cohen building. Can you share kind of the human experience of being in there, and thinking about Social Security interacting with the art?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. The building is just imbued with such incredible meaning. You can really feel the excitement and energy of the 1930s moving past kind of that Great Depression and moving towards something so meaningful as Social Security. The artwork, I hope you all get the chance to see it, and the building is around for a long, long time, but it's just stunning. Pictures, pictures can show you what's there, but until you really experience it in real life, I don't think you can get that feeling. On the converse side, like I'm not gonna paint like the rosy picture. Like the building needs help, it needs investment, and whether it's that federal investment that was envisioned before to turn it into agency space, or like you mentioned, Mary, a private-public partnership. Um, I don't necessarily choose sides in this at this point. I just want to see this building have the new life breathed into it and to allow future generations to experience that incredible meaning of the Social Security.
Worth saying too, by the way, that the GSA just very recently opened up public tours. They've sold out within like 24 hours, but the possibility of seeing the interior of the building. So if that's something that you're interested in, feel free to contact us at Living New Deal, to write to the GSA. I think the more people want to go in and see the building, the better. So that is a possibility this year, which is exciting and a little bit of a comfort this spring, as we all, anxiously await to see what will happen with the Section 106 process.
Do it if you get the chance. The tour before, I've gotten to experience it before. It's worth it. It's incredible. They do a great job.
Yeah, yeah, I have yet to be on the tour. I got COVID the last time I was in DC and couldn't go. And so I look forward to going this spring. There was a question which I'm not sure how to answer, but maybe some of our legal experts can. Has the Cohen building been deemed eligible for NHL status? And is that a designation that's in process or could be proposed?
I'm not aware of it being deemed NHL eligible, and it is a long process for NHL designation.
It,
Um,
I can step in. I know it's National Register listed. It's not a National Historic Landmark. And as Betsy said, that's a really rare designation. And maybe with our advocacy, we can push to get it there one day. But as of now, it's just National Register listed.
Do you know, Daniel, whether the National Register listing indicates its level of significance, national, state, or whatever? Do you know?
I believe it's just listed at the local level.
Local, okay.
That's kind of the bread and butter one to get through. Um, for it's just the standard, I guess.
Okay.
There's a question here about developers, some of whom are kinder to historic buildings than others, and do we support, adaptive reuse? I hope that's clear that yes, we'd like to see this building treated well. And I've certainly, from the beginning of working on this to more recently, with the help of some of the folks on this panel, have come around to the idea that in some cases, private industry does a phenomenal job of restoring and taking care of buildings. In my neck of the woods in San Francisco, Rincon Annex, which was the main post office, for example, was purchased, and its lobby with these incredible murals is open 24/7 for the public to come in and see. It'd be great to have a similar kind of public access made available. That's a point about this building that we would really like to see. Not just preservation, but access to the artwork so people can enjoy them. This is the kind of art that in another country, would, like, everybody would be announcing to the tourists coming to Washington, D.C., and school groups would be marched through to look at Social Security's history and these incredible artworks. And it tells you a lot about our country, not just with this administration, but the past from the New Deal on, of how we treat public art and public buildings. And maybe all the crises of this last year and moving forward is an opportunity for us to rethink some of those things in our society, the values and the investments that we do or don't make in public art, in historic preservation, in, arts education, and so on.
I just wanted to add that absolutely. I think the covenants, of course, will be helpful in kind of guiding any of the private work that happens on the building. But the other benefit for private developers is that the building is on the National Register, so they can avail of federal historic tax credits for any of the work that they do on the building, which actually makes it, gives them a financial incentive to do the work. So that's another helpful thing they can avail of.
Yeah, and there was a comment in the chat as well. I didn't say this, but the Cohen building is, I didn't point it out when we showed the kind of close up of the mall. It is right next to the mall. It's like a block away, and it's very close to the US Capitol. It's right in the center of things, which is part of the reason that it should remain there. There's this great 1938 historic photo that I found recently looking at digital newspapers from the 30s of the 1938 plan for DC, and it's all like federal agency headquarters and museums. Like that's most of the plan. And the Cohen building is there, which is a different kind of worldview of what Washington, D.C. and the federal government should look like.
I think we also have to think of Cohen in the context of this entire quadrant. So reimagining, it's hard to argue, I think, sometimes about just one building, when you're not necessarily seeing it in context. I would hope that, folks, between DC and the Planning Commission and the Historic Preservation Officer, the state, the SHPO, and all the other stakeholders in DC, like, look at the entire federal Southwest quadrant and see that, yeah, there's other examples of historic buildings in that quadrant that have been turned into apartments and condos, while maintaining at least the historic facade or a reimagined design, that went up slightly. But there's certainly examples right in that neighborhood. But if you're going to reimagine that neighborhood, I think it's important to think about a master plan and it could be amazing mixed use. There could be commercial, there could be restaurants. Again, it could be south of the mall. They could call it Soma, and it's a whole way to bring folks back into the city, as opposed to the way that area traditionally operated, which was people would go to work and then they'd leave and empty the city out. So it could absolutely be a transformative neighborhood for renewing urban lands, living in DC. And developers would, I think, tell you, one, they want to know what the rules are, what they can change and what they can't change. So, if you're arguing about three other buildings that could be changed dramatically or potentially demolished because they're not historic, then you can focus on the Cohen being more of a public space, with mixed use of some kind, perhaps an academic institution, or reimagining, the agencies that are headquartered in that area, with a smaller workforce being in one place. Again, the proximity to the place, having the federal agencies all in within the city is certainly valuable. But then I think developers would also say location, location, location. I mean, that is primo location. I cannot imagine that if it became mixed use and included some kind of housing, or if an academic institution that wasn't really present in DC now, wanted to expand and have innovative classrooms in that building, that couldn't be done. So there's lots of good examples of buildings being reimagined and spaces being reimagined, that could be a really positive outcome all the way around.
Well, Michelle, I feel like what you're talking about is kind of just like the neighborhood version, like expanded out. What we're talking about doing in the building, you're talking about doing throughout the Southwest corridor.
Yes.
And this is how we use our imaginations as city planners, historic preservationists.
Yeah.
It's worth saying, I think, because that was another shock to me, that in the course of litigation, it came out that the only two possibilities for the White House East Wing project that were considered was demolition or no demolition, which showed a complete lack of imagination. So I think it's my hope that we can have more ideas than that, and that's the kind of one of the concerns is not just the suppression of historic preservation, but the suppression of any other ideas about what's possible with these historic sites, with Southwest DC, which could be really incredible. There was a comment about Joni Ernst that says that she justified her rapid disposal of potentially lucrative public properties like the Cohen building by saying that they're ghost towns and thus wasteful, which is to say that they're not occupied and therefore are not being used. As the founder and chair of the Senate Doge Caucus, she was instrumental in making sure that the Cohen became a ghost town by gutting the Voice of America, which was its main tenant. There were also, I believe, some of the other tenants, and Dan, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the inspector generals were there, and I think there were people from Health and Human Services. So by gutting federal staff at various agencies and then removing or lowering who's in there, you make a case for waste of federal buildings. The concern being that the Cohen building is the start, right? That this kind of process is a way that you streamline accelerated disposal, making this case for waste rather than historic preservation, and more broadly, federal government employment for civil servants. Do you all have comments?
Yeah, Mary, I just wanted to say something real quick, as I think the cliche that applies is your lack of planning is not my emergency. Um, so, that's my snark coming through, I guess, a little bit.
Anyone else have thoughts about building? Okay.
I don't know. I want to jump in because I've seen this kind of from various quarters, these questions to preservationists and going back to this idea that, I don't think that personally, I think it's worthwhile if the government is, downsizing its workforce. We may not agree with the way they did it, but, the projections are, I think this happened, I think a few years ago, actually, before the current administration, that they said if you have less than 60% utilization rate, in the building, then you kind of want to improve that because we're paying all this money for the buildings not being occupied. So personally, I think some kind of measure of efficiency, making sure that again taxpayers' money dollars that are being used. I think the larger problem here for me, as I was looking through kind of the history of GSA dispositions and the current narrative around it, is this whole role of deferred maintenance. They had stewards of these really significant historic buildings, and they let them come to a state where they are in really poor condition, and that they justify the cost that it is going to take to preserve the buildings as the reason for why they can build a suburban office that is much cheaper. So this whole model of not building maintenance into their care and stewardship of the big buildings from the get-go creates this problem in the first place. So to me, that is the larger issue than the current kind of, emergency of the buildings being surplus, which could be a valid argument, but
I have to say that's a broader criticism of New Deal materials in general, which the New Deal produced so much art, architecture, etc., and no fund to preserve it. So that's been, for New Deal cultural heritage specifically, always been a concern. I think we're over time, and I'm sorry that I didn't notice sooner. So I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight for Preservation in Action, Saving the Wilbur J. Cohen Federal Building. It's been my honor and privilege to get to know these wonderful people and to have them join us tonight. A special thank you to all of you and also to our donors at Living New Deal who support our free public programs and our dedicated staff. Our advocacy is only possible through your support, and we're so grateful to have that be part of our organization. We also want to thank our allies in this campaign and everyone who has signed our and other related petitions, and everyone who uses our website to teach New Deal history. That's another huge part of this, is people teaching students about the New Deal, about historic preservation law, and so on. If you'd like to learn more about New Deal sites in Washington, D.C., I wanted to share that my colleague Susan Ives will be hosting another webinar later this month on February 24th, featuring David Taylor, a local writer and producer for The People's Recorder, which is a national podcast that recounts stories of American life in the 1930s using interviews and recordings made by workers from the WPA's Federal Writers Project. So if you want to see some of the other sites, New Deal sites in DC, you can join him for that, or them for that, on February 24th. You can register for free on Eventbrite for that. And as I mentioned earlier, please look out for an announcement and a link to register for another webinar featuring journalists who've been covering the Cohen Building in March. I wanted to give our speakers a chance, if you have any announcements you'd like to make before we hop off about events you have coming up, please do so, and then we'll say goodnight to everybody.
I think mine are in the chat. So we've all got to be vigilant and learn as much as we can about what's going on right now, because it's all hands on deck. Thank you so much for having us, Mary.
Thank you also so much for being with us. Thank you to everybody joining us tonight. Be well, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thanks,
Good night.
everybody.
Thank
So long.
you.
Thank you.